This summer, Toronto has experienced two major shootings in seemingly safe places, and twice in the past 2 weeks the United States has had to mourn for the lives lost at the hands of people and their guns. Citizens have cried out for years for federal gun laws to change in the USA, and while we in Canada have not experienced the same level of violence they have, people still worry here about guns creeping across our borders. Sergeant Dave Wilson is a 35-year retired member of the Toronto Police Services. He's here to give us his view on Canada's gun laws and what might need to change. So Sergeant, thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me.
So you were a cop for 35 years and you retired last year?
In 2014.
2014. So between the time that you started and retired, how did gun crimes change?
Well, gun crimes, virtually they were far and few between. When I first got on, the guns that they equipped me with are far different than the guns they equipped me with when I retired, because there was a need for a greater number of bullets that could be discharged from my firearm, as opposed to 35 years ago. 35 years ago, if I was having a bad day, I had 6 shots, 6 rounds to get off, to eliminate any threats of violence. When I retired, I had 14 shots and 2 more magazines to put in my gun if I needed to. So they've changed dramatically because there's more guns, and B, more people want the guns. And in 35 years previous, people used their hands and their fists, sometimes knives and occasionally baseball bats. Rarely did you see guns. They just weren't that prevalent.
So can you tell us what Canada's gun laws are and what you think about them?
I think our gun laws are excellent. There's a whole host of different regulations that are placed upon people who possess and own firearms, ranging from the storage to where you can discharge. And rarely are you able to, in extreme rare cases, are you able to carry a firearm. Even police officers can't carry firearms unless they're going to and from work or to a range. And that's basically, with the exception of extreme cases, that's basically the way guns are obtained or are possessed here in Canada, as opposed to the States, where you can carry one in your ankle, you can carry one on your hip, you can expose it. So the guns are very prevalent there. It's because of their constitution permits them, or actually gives them the right to bear arms or to arm themselves. Whereas here, you have to apply for and be given permission to buy a gun. And then even when you buy the gun, you're under a great deal of restrictions as to how you handle, store, and use the gun. So it's a completely different, like comparing apples to oranges.
So what are those rare cases where people can have a concealed permit here in Canada?
Ooh, well, they're only, the last time I looked at those stats, there was probably about 6 or 7 people in the country that could actually carry a firearm. And those circumstances would be in the rare cases where their safety is at an imminent or there's a very likelihood that they're going to be find themselves in need to protect themselves. So I think it's got to be the Attorney General that gives up written authorization for such a person to carry a firearm. Very, very rare. Almost, it's so rare that basically nobody in Canada is allowed to carry a firearm around. But there is the circumstances that will allow a person, after giving authorization, to do that.
Okay. So do you think that we're safer here in Canada compared to the USA?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. My frustration when it comes to the gun laws is the sentencing. There's a whole host of different offenses. Even just to possess and own a gun, there's a whole bunch of regulations that the gun owner has to adhere to. But the bad person, or the person or the ill person, the sick person, they don't think about the consequences they use to get to obtain their objective. So it's the bad people that cause the grief. I don't know if I answered your question the best.
You did.
Did? Okay.
Okay. So how have the police forces been trained to deal with events like school shootings? Because in the past week, there's been one in Arizona.
Yes.
There's been one in Oregon 2 weeks ago. So
Right.
how are Toronto and Durham police forces trained to deal with things like that?
Well, everything changed from the Columbine shooting in 1999, and pre-1999, pre-Columbine, the police forces were trained to when there was gun violence or threat of serious bodily harm, the officers that respond to the calls were trained to contain. So form a perimeter, make sure that the threat doesn't go away, and then we would call in the heavy artillery, the ETF, the Emergency Task Force officers to come in with their armor, and they would go in and clear the building and arrest the perpetrators. But since that's happened, well, while that happened in Columbine, they were waiting for their ETF people to come. The shooter was still shooting, and the police became under great criticism because the officers who attended, who were armed, didn't do anything about it. And meanwhile, there were kids being killed. So that changed the response to gun violence in Canada, certainly in Toronto and of course Durham. We now go in. We're trained now to go in as a group. We call it the diamond formation. So 4 officers will go in, one aiming that way, one facing that way, one facing that way, and one facing that way. And with our backs to each other, we go in and clear all the rooms. So while the shooting's going on, we go in and get the shooter. So it's changed dramatically. And so as opposed to waiting for the ETF to show up, the officer on the street now assembles a group, and they go in and go after the shooter to prevent anybody from being killed while the police are on scene.
Okay. Now, in the United States, there was a group called States United to Prevent Gun Violence. They had a campaign where they opened up a store, and prospective gun owners went in, and they were given a history of violent crimes that happened with certain guns. Now, how do you feel about this kind of campaign? Do you think it works?
Well, I would have thought that it would not, but I'm in favor of trying anything. If you can prevent one gun from being sold, then and potentially a life from being saved, then it's worth it. But I would think that the mindset of the American people, my opinion only, is that if they want a gun, they're going to get a gun. Guns are a staple in America, and if they want to get a gun, they'll get a gun regardless. They may not want that gun. They may go to a different gun shop because they learned the history of that gun. But I think it's because it's their right and they feel a need to protect themselves and their property, they will get a gun. So frankly, I don't see it working, but heck, it's not a bad idea. It's worth a try, but I personally don't think it would work.
And do you think their gun laws will ever change?
That's a very good question. You know, from where I sit, a little insignificant retired policeman, thinking about a great big nation like the United States of America, why it isn't like this is. I had heard that this recent shooting was the 40th mass shooting this year alone. 40th mass shooting. Toronto, it rarely has 40 murders in a year. So it's incredible. When are the Americans going to get the fact that as long as you have guns, as long as you're arming good people and allowing the bad people to access these firearms, when are you going to stop knocking off and stop selling guns? If you want to save lives, quit selling guns. Eliminate them. Outlaw them.
All right. Well, there you have it. In Canada, we are a lot safer than the United States, but the chances of guns creeping across our borders is still there.